Let's bring in MS Now Capitol Hill reporter Kevin Fry and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. She's also an MS Now legal analyst. Kevin, why did the committee release these documents and this video now, and what are the key takeaways here?
Yeah, I mean, look, the speculation, particularly from Democrats on this committee, who, of course, wanted to see this in a public forum, is that there were not a lot of revelations here. And so Republicans did not get out of this what they were hoping for. And also this gives them a chance to essentially bury this on New Year's Eve, on a day where obviously a lot of Americans, rightfully, are not really fully paying attention to the news. In terms of the takeaways here, I mean, the top line from Smith was that he believes he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt in both of the cases he was handling. Of course, to remind you, that was both the January 6th case and the 2020 election conspiracy case that led up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and then separately his handling of classified materials. That one we still don't have a lot of details about because, as Democrats are keen to point out, we have not gotten kind of the long-form report on the findings of that half of the investigative work.
All right, people, welcome back to Jack Mockler. Jack Smith's full 255-page deposition transcript has been released, revealing his assessment that Trump was, by a significant margin, the most culpable individual in the January 6th conspiracy, and that the Capitol attack simply does not occur without Trump. The authoritative conclusion from the prosecutor who built the most comprehensive evidentiary case ever against a president fundamentally changes how history will understand that day. And then we saw Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois joining the growing chorus of voices calling for Trump's removal. He posted a clip on Twitter that captured the gravity of the moment perfectly, saying that it had become evident that the president had abdicated his duty to protect the American people and the people's house.
In terms of some of the other takeaways here, he says that the cases were built not just on the word of Trump's enemies, but some of his allies, fellow Republicans as well. He batted away the suggestion that he took on the special counsel job because of any, quote, animus toward the president. He said that no, he received no pressure from President Biden to press charges against Trump, basically pushing back on the political angle of this. And he also faced questions about this reporting that has caused a stir amongst Republicans on Capitol Hill, that Jack Smith requested and took a look at the phone records of some of the key Republicans that Trump interacted with around the January 6th attack on the Capitol, basically saying, if you want to point the finger of blame, point it at the president himself. Here's that exchange.
To the extent the members of Congress and senators are up in arms that this happened to them and they're seeking accountability, who should be held accountable for answering these questions?
Well, I think who should be accountable for this is Donald Trump. These records are people, in the case of the senators, Donald Trump directed his co-conspirators to call these people to further delay the proceedings. He chose to do that. If Donald Trump had chosen to call a number of Democratic senators, we would have got toll records for a number of Democratic senators.
Kinzinger was speaking directly to Republican senators who had been hiding from their constitutional responsibilities, urging them to go back to their constituents and say that they took action when action was required, that they put country over party, that they upheld the Constitution, that they were the adults in the room when the room was on fire. That clip went viral for a reason. It captured the moral clarity that the moment demanded and the frustration that so many Americans feel watching elected officials avoid their responsibilities. But the real story here, the thing that makes this moment genuinely unprecedented, is what Jack Smith said under oath in that deposition. This is not some partisan congressional committee releasing findings that can be dismissed as politically motivated. This is a career federal prosecutor.
Part of the argument from Republicans, there was a series of senators and one House member that had their call logs reviewed, was that essentially they should be provided some degree of above boardness because they are, of course, members of Congress. One other note here, he also said that he would not be surprised if the president pursued retribution against him and directs the DOJ to try to indict him.
We shall see. Kevin Fry, thank you so much on that. And Barb, Smith was pretty forceful in defending the case against President Trump. Let's listen to what he had to say.
You just made some pretty definitive statements about, your belief that President Trump was guilty of these charges. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe we had proof beyond a reasonable doubt in both cases.
What does it tell you, Barb, that Smith has been unwavering in his conviction that not only was there enough evidence, but there was no political motivation on his part or on the part of the agency as they pursued this case?
Someone who has spent decades in the Department of Justice, who was appointed as special counsel specifically because of his independence and his prosecutorial track record, telling Congress in the most formal setting possible that the evidence shows Trump was at the center of everything. Let me take you inside exactly what makes Smith's testimony so devastating and why the release of this transcript is such a game changer. The January 6th committee had already produced an exhaustive investigative record. They compiled thousands of pages of testimony, documentary evidence, and findings that established the most detailed public picture of the events leading to the Capitol attack that any congressional investigation had ever assembled. But what Smith's deposition adds to that record is something different and uniquely significant. It provides the independent assessment of a career federal prosecutor who spent years evaluating all of that evidence and more.
A non-event. That's the way the Justice Department traditionally does pursue its cases, based on the massive evidence that Jack Smith amassed and described in both his report and in the indictment. There's really no basis to believe that this was some political witch hunt, and yet we have heard this again and again from Donald Trump and from some of his supporters. I thought Jack Smith did an excellent job of debunking some of those claims. For one, there was this through line where there were a number of questions about, wasn't this just President Trump exercising his free speech rights to contest an election just as other presidents throughout history have done? And he explained, no, that's not what this was. He did have a right to claim he won the election, even falsely. But what he did that was illegal was to commit fraud by using the power of government, by trying to coerce state legislators, by trying to coerce members of Congress, by using false slates of electors to try to thwart the peaceful and lawful transfer of power. And so I think that anybody who watches this video or reads this transcript will be left with the impression that
Smith had the authority to charge federal crimes. He actually did charge Trump with conspiracy. And now he is on the congressional record saying that the evidence clearly established Trump as the most culpable person in the conspiracy. That prosecutorial assessment, independent of the congressional investigation, built on a separate investigative record, expressed in the specific language of a criminal prosecutor rather than a political committee, is what makes the December 31st release so historically significant. The institutional weight of Smith's testimony cannot be overstated. He was not a congressional investigator with a political mandate. He was a career federal prosecutor who spent decades in the Department of Justice before being appointed as special counsel specifically to conduct independent investigations of Trump's post-election conduct and his classified document retention.
There's nothing political about this. This was a very strong criminal case.
Smith said the strongest aspect of the January 6th case was actually based on evidence provided by, quote, Republicans who put their allegiance to the country above the party. What do you make of the idea that Smith apparently built most of the compelling pieces of his case around Trump's allies?
Yeah, so it's both a good strategy, I suppose, because it rebuts any claim that these are just political actors with an axe to grind. But it's also just smart prosecution and investigation. The people who know best what was going on were the people closest to Donald Trump. Rudy Giuliani was a witness who talked about admitting that he knew that this was false, admitting that he knew that the claims he made about Ruby Freeman were false. People like the Secretary of State of Arizona, the Secretary of State of Georgia, election officials in some of the key swing states. There was an elector in Pennsylvania. These were the people who were refusing to budge because they knew there was no fraud in the election. These are the people who, I think, heroically put their...
His independence from political pressure was a specific institutional feature of his role that gave his conclusions weight that politically appointed investigators cannot claim. The specific obligation to evaluate evidence under the framework of federal criminal law rather than the framework of political accountability means that when Smith says the evidence clearly indicates something, he is applying an evidentiary standard that is more rigorous and more systematically applied than the standards that govern political investigations. When that person says in a formal congressional proceeding that the evidence clearly indicates Trump was most culpable by a significant margin and that the attack does not occur without him, those words carry the weight of a career prosecutor's independent assessment built on years of evidence gathering under the most demanding evidentiary standards available. That institutional weight is what makes this release as significant as it is. Now, let's get into the specific content of what Smith actually said, because the specific words matter enormously. The most important individual statement in the entire deposition is the one that has been ricocheting across every news platform since the transcript was released. The statement that the Capitol attack does not occur without Trump. This is the most direct and the most authoritative prosecutorial assessment of causal responsibility in the entire public record of the January 6th accountability story. Smith said that not as a political opinion or as advocacy for a particular interpretive lens on the events. He said it as a prosecutor who had spent years gathering the evidence. The call logs, the witness interviews, the documentary record that supported that conclusion. The call logs that Smith described show how Trump's White House and his co-conspirators contacted Republican lawmakers before and during January 6th to delay or block the certification of the Electoral College vote. Those contacts, documented in phone records obtained through the investigative power of the special counsel's office, established the specific coordination between Trump's operation and the congressional pressure campaign that was running simultaneously with the March on the Capitol. The witness testimony Smith described included Republicans who contradicted Trump's stolen election claims, even at personal risk. These are witnesses he described as providing some of the most powerful evidence in the entire investigation, because their willingness to go on record against the narrative they were politically aligned with gives their testimony credibility that politically motivated witnesses would not have. And the documentary evidence included Trump's own words, his January 6th speech in which he urged supporters to go to the Capitol, telling them to march there and to be strong, and the communications that documented his active involvement in directing the pressure campaign against Pence in Congress in the days and hours before the attack. All of that together is what Smith summarized when he said does not occur without Trump. That summary is built on years of specific documented evidence that Smith personally reviewed and evaluated. The written special counsel report and his specific findings about Trump's direction of supporters to the Capitol are equally devastating. The report concluded that there was sufficient evidence to charge Trump with a criminal scheme to overturn the election, and that Trump explicitly directed supporters to march on the Capitol. These findings, combined with the deposition testimony, formed the most authoritative available prosecutorial assessment of Trump's January 6 conduct. Smith's written report concluded that the evidence was sufficient to charge Trump, that the evidence met the legal standard of probable cause for the specific charges of conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to obstruct the certification of the Electoral College vote, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against the rights of American citizens. That probable cause conclusion is the prosecutorial determination that the evidence was strong enough to proceed to trial, and it is the same evidence base that Smith drew on when he told the House Judiciary Committee that Trump was the most culpable individual in the conspiracy by a significant margin. The report's specific finding that Trump explicitly directed supporters to march on the Capitol is the most direct documentary link between Trump's words and the events of January 6th. The finding that his Ellipse speech was not just political rhetoric, but a specific directive that his supporters followed to the Capitol is the prosecutorial characterization of the speech and the surrounding conduct that distinguishes it from constitutionally protected political advocacy and places it within the framework of the criminal conspiracy charges. Smith's team analyzed Trump's words in the context of the broader coordination evidence. Trump told the crowd to walk down to the Capitol. He said they had to show strength. He said they were going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and to the Capitol. Those specific directions to a crowd that Trump knew included people who were prepared to take aggressive action in the context of a day of planned pressure on Congress and Pence are what prosecutors characterized as explicit direction rather than political rhetoric. The specific combination of the directional language in the speech, the prior coordination between Trump's operation and people planning aggressive action, the call log evidence showing simultaneous congressional contact during the march, and the witness testimony about what Trump knew his supporters were capable of and willing to do, these are the specific evidentiary elements that together support the explicit direction finding. The broader congressional record that Smith's deposition adds to the January 6th committee's work creates a comprehensive evidentiary picture that is greater than the sum of its parts. The House January 6th committee had already established through its own exhaustive investigation a comprehensive picture of the pressure campaign that Trump and his allies ran against Mike Pence, against state officials, and against Congress in the weeks following the 2020 election. The committee's investigation documented the specific conversations, the specific demands, and the specific decisions through which that pressure campaign was organized and executed. What Smith's deposition adds to that picture is the prosecutorial synthesis, a federal prosecutor with independent investigative authority, saying that the same evidence and the additional evidence gathered through his own investigation established Trump as most culpable by a significant margin and established that the Capitol attack does not occur without him. The combination of the congressional investigation's comprehensive documentary record and Smith's prosecutorial assessment of that record and his own additional evidence creates the most complete and most authoritatively evaluated evidentiary picture of January 6th that any public record has contained. The specific content of Trump's Ellipse speech has been analyzed extensively by legal experts, and Smith's characterization of it as explicit direction rather than protected political speech is grounded in the specific legal framework of the criminal conspiracy charges. Trump told the crowd to walk down to the Capitol. He told them to show strength. He told them they were going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue into the Capitol. Those specific directions to a crowd that Trump knew included people who were prepared to take aggressive action in the context of a day of planned pressure on Congress and Pence are what prosecutors characterized as explicit direction rather than political rhetoric. The NPR analysis of the speech highlighted how Trump's words were not vague or ambiguous. They were specific directives to a specific location at a specific time given to a crowd that Trump had been told included people who were prepared to use force to achieve their objectives. The combination of the directional language, the prior coordination, the call log evidence, and the witness testimony created an evidentiary foundation that Smith concluded supported the explicit direction finding. The December 31st release puts a career federal prosecutor's specific and direct assessment of Trump's central causal role, in his own words, under oath in a formal congressional proceeding into the permanent record in a way that is qualitatively different from the January 6th committee's own findings. Congressional committee findings are the conclusions of a political institution subject to partisan challenge, to allegations of political motivation, and to the political dynamics that had made the January 6th investigation itself a partisan battleground rather than a universally acknowledged accountability proceeding. A federal prosecutor's assessment drawn from an independent investigation, expressed in the specific evaluative language of criminal prosecution, offered in a formal congressional proceeding under the same obligations of accuracy that govern all congressional testimony, carries a different kind of institutional authority. When Smith says the evidence clearly indicates Trump was the most culpable individual in the conspiracy, he is not a partisan congressman making a political argument. He is the career federal prosecutor who charged Trump, making a prosecutorial assessment of the evidence he gathered. That distinction, partisan political finding versus independent prosecutorial assessment, is what makes the December 31st release as significant as it is. Smith's specific statement that the Capitol attack does not occur without Trump is the most direct and the most authoritatively delivered causal accountability statement in the entire public record of January 6 proceedings. More direct than the committee's findings, more authoritatively delivered than any political commentary. More specifically grounded in the prosecutorial evidence that Smith gathered through his own independent investigation than any congressional investigation could produce through its own authority alone. The central accountability question about January 6th is not whether bad things happened or even whether Trump was involved. It is whether Trump caused them. whether the attack is a result of Trump's conduct that flows from his choices and his directives, rather than a coincident event that happened on the same day that Trump was also making politically aggressive statements. Smith's does not occur formulation answers the causal question directly, not that Trump was associated with the attack, not that his rhetoric was inflammatory, but that the attack itself is causally dependent on Trump's conduct and would not have occurred without it. That specific causal accountability is the most important conclusion in the entire investigation, and Smith stated it directly on the congressional record. Smith's description of the evidence as clearly indicating Trump was the most culpable individual in the conspiracy by a significant margin is the most specific and the most authoritatively evidenced prosecutorial credibility assessment in the movie accountability record. Its significance is amplified by the specific category of evidence Smith highlighted as most powerful, the testimony of Republicans who contradicted the stolen election claims at personal political risk. The most culpable formulation is not a relative comparison designed to diminish other participants' accountability. It is a direct statement that the evidence established Trump as the principal in the conspiracy, rather than as one of many equally responsible participants. The person whose direction, authorization, and central role made him qualitatively more accountable than anyone else in the scheme. The Republican witnesses Smith described as most powerful evidence, the people who told investigators things that contradicted the stolen election narrative at personal political cost to themselves, are the most credible possible category of testimony for this specific purpose. A Democratic official saying Trump lied about the election carries less credibility than a Republican official saying the same thing, precisely because the Republican has no political incentive to make the admission. Smith's identification of Republican contradictors as most powerful evidence reflects the prosecutorial understanding that credibility comes from the alignment between what witnesses say and what their incentives would be if they were lying. The permanent congressional record now contains a career federal prosecutor's specific and direct assessments of Trump's causal role in January 6th and his position as most culpable in the conspiracy. Those assessments are now available to every future investigation, every future accountability proceeding, and every future historical evaluation of the Trump era as independent prosecutorial conclusions rather than partisan political characterizations. The January 6th accountability story has been contested at the level of facts and interpretations by partisans who have characterized every accountability finding as politically motivated rather than evidence-based. Smith's testimony is the hardest available evidence against that characterization, a career federal prosecutor, not a partisan congressional committee, making specific findings about specific evidence in a formal proceeding. Those findings are now in the permanent record. They can be cited. They can be evaluated against the evidence Smith describes. They represent the most authoritarian available prosecutorial conclusion about January 6 that any public document contains. The December 31st release did not prove everything in a legally final sense. Proving things in a legally final sense is what trials do, and no trial of Trump on the election interference charges has occurred. But it added the most authoritative prosecutorial assessment of the evidence to the permanent record in a way that strengthens and substantiates the accountability narrative built on years of congressional and investigative work. Trump and his defenders will argue that Smith's testimony is the biased assessment of a partisan prosecutor who was appointed specifically to go after Trump and whose conclusions reflect his mandate rather than the evidence. They will argue that the does not occur formulation is speculation about counterfactual history rather than a prosecutorial finding grounded in specific evidence. They will argue that the release of the deposition was itself a partisan act by a Democratic-aligned House committee designed to damage Trump rather than to serve legitimate oversight purposes. Here is the direct response to those arguments. Smith's career as a federal prosecutor spans multiple administrations and includes work that targeted both Republican and Democratic political figures. His record as a career prosecutor does not support the characterization of a partisan figure pursuing a politically motivated investigation. The does not occur formulation is not speculation about counterfactual history in a vacuum. It is the conclusion of a prosecutor who reviewed years of evidence about the specific planning, coordination, and communication that preceded and accompanied the January 6th attack, and who is expressing his evidence-based judgment about the causal dependence of the attack on Trump's conduct. The House Judiciary Committee that released the deposition is a Republican-led committee. Its decision to release the transcript reflects an institutional judgment that the accountability record should be public, not a partisan Democratic effort to damage Trump. The 255-page transcript of Jack Smith's congressional deposition is the most authoritatively delivered and the most comprehensively evidenced prosecutorial assessment of Trump's January 6 conduct that any public record has contained. It puts a career federal prosecutor on the congressional record saying, "does not occur without Trump," and most culpable by a significant margin. Two formulations that together constitute the most direct causal and comparative accountability statements about January 6th that the independent prosecutorial assessment of the available evidence has produced. It does not constitute a formal legal finding of guilt. No finding of guilt was made because the election interference cases were dropped by political circumstance rather than determined at trial, but it constitutes the permanent record of an independent prosecutor's conclusion about what the evidence showed, a record that is now available to every future accountability proceeding, every future investigation, and every future historical evaluation of what happened in the period between the 2020 election and January 20th of 2021. In that permanent record, Smith's specific words about "does not occur" causal dependence and most culpable comparative accountability in the permanent congressional transcript is the accountability contribution of the December 31st release that no subsequent political development can remove from the historical record. The full evidentiary picture assembled by Smith's investigation and the January 6 committee together shows the specific coordination between Trump's operation and the congressional pressure campaign that was running simultaneously with the march on 5/4, the Capitol. Legal experts who have analyzed the significance of having Smith's prosecutorial conclusions permanently in the congressional record emphasize that this is the kind of evidence that history will rely on. Future historians writing about the Trump era will have access to a permanent record that includes the independent prosecutorial assessment of a career federal prosecutor who concluded that the evidence showed Trump was the central cause of the January 6 attack. This is not a moment that can be dismissed or minimized. This is not political theater. This is the documented record of what an independent prosecutor found after years of investigation. And that record will outlast every defense, every counter-argument, every attempt to rewrite history. The evidence is now permanently part of the congressional record. Jack Smith's words are now permanently part of the historical record. And no amount of political spin can change what he said or the evidence he based it on. The Capitol attack does not occur without Trump, most culpable by a significant margin. Those words are now carved into the permanent record of American history, and they will be cited by every future investigation and every future historian who seeks to understand what happened on January 6th and who was truly responsible. The release of this deposition transcript marks a turning point in the January 6th accountability story. It transforms the debate from one about political interpretations to one about documented evidence. It shifts the conversation from what people believe happened to what an independent prosecutor determined the evidence shows, and it creates a permanent record that cannot be erased or ignored. For those who have been demanding real accountability, this is the moment they have been waiting for. For those who have been avoiding their responsibilities, this is the moment they can no longer hide. The evidence is clear. The prosecutor has spoken, and history is watching to see what happens next. The transcript is now public, and it's a document that will define how this chapter of American history is remembered. The words are there, the evidence is there, and the conclusion is unmistakable. Jack Smith said what he said, and he said it under oath in a formal congressional proceeding. The record is now permanent, and it speaks for itself.